Hey boys and girls, this is Navinata No Limit Hold'em for the second installment of Get Better Faster, and we're going to be talking about line creation, how to play hands of varying strengths, and it really probably ought to say how to play hands of varying strengths against varying or different opponents. So when planning your line, and the line is just simply what actions you plan on taking based on your opponent's responses on every street, insofar as you can think ahead and to whatever level you can think ahead. So there are a lot of considerations that have to be kind of thought out before you decide on a line with a specific hand in a specific spot against a specific villain. The relevant ranges, that would be your range, your actual range, but mostly your perceived range. And then all of the ranges of all the opponents that are involved in the hand, that's the relevant ranges. Stack sizes are going to make somewhere between a big difference and a huge difference. Sometimes it won't make that much of a difference, or I guess that's not true. It'll always make a huge difference, but sometimes it'll be a more standard spot. And sometimes it will be one of those outliers, like when you're 500 big blinds deep. That's going to definitely have an effect on the type of lines you want to take with the different valued parts of your range. And when you've only got an SPR or a stack-to-pot ratio of 1 going to the flop, that's definitely going to have a big effect on the way that you're going to play your hand. Metagame dynamics, reads, history, HUD stats, images, yours and those of your opponents, etc., etc. Your opponent's disposition, his kind of overall style, and his propensities towards mistakes of different types, the necessity or lack thereof to balance your range, and then another one I want to talk about a little bit is range splitting considerations, and that is just that there are times to split your range and times to keep it intact. Sometimes you want to keep your entire range intact because there's just not that much value in taking an option with, taking option A with part of your range and option B with another part of your range, because just the vast majority of your range wants to exercise option A. So taking option B is going to just kind of turn that part of your range face up. So it's kind of like a balance consideration, and the question you'll have to ask yourself some of the time is it more important to keep my range intact in this hand or to split my range to maximize my vacuum EV, or the EV of this one hand taken out of context of the entire game or match or session or career, or however you want to look at it. An example of this idea here, maybe I 3-bet pocket kings and get called by a player who is out of position against me. The flop comes out ace, rag, rag. He checks to me. Do I want to check back and treat my hand like showdown value and try to get it one street closer to showdown? Maybe induce him to pick off a bluff on the turn, or be able to feel more comfortable about value betting 1 or 2 streets once your opponent checks a second time. Or is this a situation where my opponent's pretty good and just knows that I'm going to c-bet all of my air and all of my big value hands on this flop, in which case maybe I should just c-bet my entire range. Your relative hand values, what we're talking about here, and this is kind of an interesting consideration, but these are probably the ones that are going to come up the most often. This last consideration that we talked about first, the difference between vacuum EV and overall, like long-term EV, it's going to be different based on a lot of different things, like how long do you expect to be playing with the same players or player, how good is he, is he going to be able to figure out what you're doing, is he going to adjust properly, will you have opportunities to counter exploit, maybe you can get him zigging and you can zag, so there's a lot that goes into this. Generally I don't worry so much about my long-term EV until I'm given a reason to, because I feel like even if I do something like check back pocket kings on an ace-high flop after I 3-bet in position, the hand might not go to showdown, and if it doesn't, then it doesn't matter. And if it does go to showdown, not only do I think a lot of players will fail to adjust, but if they do, I can just exploit their adjustments. But that's definitely debatable. But we definitely need to ask, is my hand closer to a bluff, a value hand, or a bluff catcher? And there's different gradients of this that we're going to get into as well. But by and large, you're either bluffing, playing a value hand, or bluff catching in any given hand of poker. And is that likely, that being the relative hand value, the relative strength of my hand on the flop, is that likely to change on future streets? So how volatile is the board? If it's like a bunch of low-suited connected cards, then top pair, top kicker on the flop is maybe not going to be worth that much on the river. Or maybe even, like a hand or a flop like King 10 Deuce Rainbow is going to be very static, and so you're much more likely to be way ahead or way behind in the hand than you would be on a board of like Jack 10 8 two-tone. So the wetness and overall volatility, or the dryness or overall stasis, however you'd say that, of the flop or the board, wherever you're at in your decision point, it's going to have a big impact on the lines that you choose to take, or it should. And will my opponent's tendencies shift my hand to one side or the other side of the spectrum? And I'm going to show the spectrum. But generally, we're always going to play one of these hands. We're going to be playing nutted value, showdown value, a draw, or a bluff. Those are the only hands you can really have if you want to look at it that way. I mean, you could break it down further, but really, you're going to have something that's the nuts, or, even if it's not the stone cold nuts, the actual nuts, you're going to have a hand that's you're going to play as the effective nuts. You're going to play it the same way you would play as the nuts. Or a value hand of some sort, maybe it's a 2-street value or a 3-street value hand. And then a showdown value or a bluff catcher, something you prefer just to take the showdown, but you don't mind picking off one street, inducing a bluff and picking it off. So with the nuts, we're going to try to get as much money in as possible. With our value hands, we're going to try to target parts of our opponent's range that we can get called by that are worse than our value hand. Showdown value, we're going to try to get it to showdown while putting as little money in as possible. And remember, this can change from one street to the next. After your opponent checks twice, second pair might go from showdown value to value. If you decide to check it back a second time, then second pair on the flop might go from showdown value to almost nutted value on the river, where you're just never going to fold it. So we've got nuts, value, showdown value, draw. And draws are going to change a lot based on the opponents that we're playing against. And then we've got air or bluffs, where really the only way to win the pot is to take it down before showdown. So you're always going to be taking one of these hands against one of these opponents. And again, there's gradients of these, and there's mixes of them. There's different types and subtypes of these archetypical hand types and archetypical villains, but we're generally going to be playing the nuts, a value hand, showdown value, draw, or bluff against a player that calls too often, folds too often, or is overly aggressive. And where this meets this is where the line happens. That's kind of where the rubber meets the road. The spectrum I'm talking about, and this is something I came up with on my own. It's a concept. It's really, really cool. I think it's very, I'm proud of it. I think it makes a lot of sense. It conveys a lot of information, and it's very efficient in its information delivering, but it's not perfect, because there are outliers and there are exceptions, but we'll talk about that. In general, the spectrum goes like this: nutted value to showdown value to draw to air, or nuts to nutted value to showdown value to bluff catcher to big draw to little draw to bluff or air. It depends on how much you want to chop that up and how you want to how picky you want to get about segmenting it off. But remember, it is a spectrum, so it's not like a black and white thing with just X number of levels. It just moves kind of slowly, steadily from one side to the next. But there's also a special property of the center of the spectrum, which is what I feel like I've kind of added to poker wisdom. So the closer my hand is to one side or the other of the spectrum, the more incentive I have to bet it. The closer my hand is to the the center, the less incentive I have to bet it. So we can see again, going from nutted value to showdown value from left to right, and going from air to showdown value from right to left, the further we are on the outskirts, the more incentive we have to bet, either to, in the case of nutted value, to get paid off by worse hands, or the case of air, to get better hands to fold. And the closer we get to the center, the less incentive we have to bet, because then we end up in a situation where it's difficult to bet and get called by worse, and it's difficult to bet and get better hands to fold. So our opponent can affect where we are on the spectrum, in a sense, or the way that we're going to treat our hand. The more our opponent likes to call, the closer our range shifts towards the value side of the spectrum. The tighter our opponent is, the nittier he is, the less action he likes to give, the bigger hand he's going to need to continue with, the further our range shifts to the bluff side of the spectrum, or the right side of the spectrum. And here's the kind of neat thing. The more aggressive our opponent is, the more he pulls our entire range back towards the center line of the spectrum. And note, this is what I was talking about. It doesn't always hold. This part is not strictly true. In the case of the extreme outliers, the actual nuts and the total air in our range against a maniac, this won't always hold. But in general, most of our hands and against most opponents, the spectrum is going to work out just like this. And I'm going to show the spectrum again, nutted value to value, to showdown value, to draw to air. And the closer my hand is to one side or the other, the more incentive I have to bet. The closer it is to the center, the less incentive I have to bet. Some examples. We have a marginal strong value hand versus a calling station. Well, that means our hand is shifted closer to value. It's not really marginal or showdown value. It's a value hand that we can bet and get called by worse. If we have a value hand against a nit or a really tight player, our hand is going to play closer to showdown value. So again, we have this shift where our value hand is shifted over to the other side of the spectrum because our opponent is nitty. If we have a value hand against a maniac, our hand plays best if we play it like a bluff catcher. We don't want to bet second pair and get raised, right? But we don't mind checking second pair and having a maniac bet into us and being able to pick off bluffs. If we have a draw against the calling station, we can bring the spectrum out, print it out, look at it, and it always kind of works this way. We have a draw, our opponent's a station, so we ought to play it more like a bluff catcher, more like showdown value, because we're going to do more checking and calling and less betting and raising. Or if we have a draw against a nit, in that case, we're going to shift it to the other side of the spectrum, and it's going to play a little bit like our air does. It's going to play like a bluff. We're not expecting to have a lot of implied odds when we take a draw up against a nit, and when we don't have implied odds, we likely do have fold equity. When we don't have fold equity, we likely do have implied odds, and that kind of accounts for this. And again, it all falls pretty neatly on the spectrum. So one example of a real hand, if we're playing heads up, let's say we raise to 2.5 big blinds off of the 75 big blind stack, or effective stacks, with King 7 suited and get called. The flop comes out Ace King 2 rainbow. Against an unknown opponent, our hand is right in between value and showdown value. You could bet and then check it down, or you could check it back and hope to induce a bluff or start value betting on the turn. You're probably looking for one or two streets here. However, if we're playing against a complete calling station, then our hand shifts way over to the value side of the spectrum, and we might even be able to get 3 bets in and get called by worse hands against a total calling station. Against a, that may be a little bit optimistic, but it certainly could be the case. Now, against a nit, we shift it from value to showdown value, and we really just want to try to take it to showdown, try to put as little money into the pot as possible and get to showdown and hopefully win with the best hand. Against a maniac, then we move it towards the middle again. Again, our value hand is going to shift, or our showdown value or thin value is going to shift more towards bluff catcher or pure showdown value against a player that's likely to make a lot of betting and raising mistakes. One more example. We open the 2.5 big blinds off of 75 big blinds with Ace King suited, this is supposed to say. So Ace of Clubs, King of Clubs. The flop comes out 2 of Clubs, 4 of Clubs, 9 of Diamonds. Versus an unknown, we play it like a draw. Versus a calling station, again, it shifts from draw to the left, and it becomes something like showdown value. We're going to do a lot of checking and calling, try to get it to the next street. So it's just like trying to get it one street closer to showdown. And then once it improves, if it improves, then of course now we've got a value hand and we can start betting it for value against the calling station. Against a tight player, a nit, we shift it to the right side of the spectrum and we can use it as a bluff because again we're not going to have the implied odds, so we should have more fold equity. Versus a complete maniac, we shift it towards the middle of the spectrum and once again it becomes a check call type hand that we're hoping to not get blown off of our equity and get a chance to realize as much equity as possible. So that's kind of the way I look at it. One more time, your spectrum is netted value to showdown value, to draw, to air, and your opponents are calls too often, folds too often, and is overly aggressive. And you're always kind of playing one of these hands against one of those opponents, very generally speaking. And the closer your hand is to one side of the spectrum, the more incentive you have to bet, and then you weigh in your opponent's propensities into that equation, and it'll shift it to one side of the spectrum or the other. I think if you didn't understand that all, if you rewatch it one more time, you'll probably get it, maybe print it out, look at it, write it down, see if you can come up with exceptions. I'd love to talk to you about it, and this is 100% Navanad poker, I was going to say mythos, but let's hope not. Poker wisdom. It's, yeah, let's go with wisdom. It's 100% my creation. At least the spectrum is. So I'd love to hear your reactions. I did want to lead with this because I want to do continue the series looking at how we play, how we create lines with certain types of hands. I did one a while back on how to play very strong hands, like when to slow play, when not to slow play, that sort of thing. Maybe go back and look at that because I think I'm going to skip over that and move into like maybe how to play draws and then maybe do showdown value bluff catchers, etc., etc. But I wanted to just start out with this overall hand framing. How do you frame your hand? How do you come up with a line quickly that's probably going to be relatively effective most of the time against most of your opponents? So, yeah, until next time, good quote, L-U-C-K, exclamation point, end quote, Navanad, over and out.